Well, good morning. If you're one of the people who try to check in and see our Mount Pleasant services this morning, it's a little different. It'll just be me kind of giving you a snapshot of what the sermon would have been about. It won't be the whole sermon, just kind of a glimpse of it. I know some of the people who watch this and keep up with us live in warmer areas of the country, in Georgia or California, and then they might be surprised why we got some snow. So because of that, we're kind of going a different direction, and we want to encourage you. If you are watching this today, and really the main reason we're doing the video is to take this day and some of the time you normally would have spent maybe going to church or focusing on a longer service, and take some time just to be quiet with God and thank God for all the good things He's doing in your life. Ask Him to give you opportunities to share your faith and to share what it is you believe. The stuff we were going to talk about in the sermon today was all out of Galatians 2. That's a great passage. If you get a chance to read it, I really would encourage you to. It talks about a fight that Peter, the great apostle Peter, and Paul, the great apostle Paul, that they had with one another. And it says that Paul accused Peter to his face, he says, because he thought Peter was wrong. And then Paul recounts what the fight was about. Apparently, when Paul and Peter were both at this church in Antioch, which is a great big city north of Israel there, it was kind of a very heavy non-Jewish population. And some Jews there, but a lot of non-Jews. And the church had grown and grown and grown, and most of the church growth had been non-Jewish people. And when Paul and Peter were there at first, Peter was hanging out with everybody. He wasn't really putting up any walls. He was hanging out with people who were fantastically religious, people who had been Jewish people before they were Christians and had followed the law of Moses their whole lives. But he's also hanging out with people who had been pretty far from God, who had had no connection at all to the God of the Bible until very recently. And Paul mentions that Peter would eat with them, and probably then would eat what they were eating. It doesn't say that for sure, but I think that's a pretty logical inference that Peter would eat what they ate. He had a vision about that, Peter did, in Acts chapter 10 and 11, that not to call anything unclean that God had made clean. And so now he's with the Gentiles. And it's kind of the same advice that Paul had given in other places. When I'm with the Jews, I act like a Jew. When I'm with the non-Jews, I act like a non-Jew. And Peter was probably doing that too. And then these guys came from Jerusalem, and they were more higher ups in the church, and they had all been Jewish before they were Christian. And they had all followed all those rules all their lives. And when they saw Peter eating with the Gentiles, it offended them. And it says that Peter was scared of this group. And we don't know if he was scared that he'd look bad, he'd look like he was a sinner, or that they wouldn't like him as much, or that they'd talk bad about him behind his back, or whatever it was. But it says that Peter started just to eat with those guys. He wouldn't eat with the non-Jews anymore. And when Paul noticed that, he said he's just offended as much as he could be. And he really, he confronted Peter in front of everybody, really ticked off about it. And he said, that stuff won't save us. And then he talks about, he has a long summary of the argument afterward in verses 15 to 21. And Paul, remembering that, says, we know that we who are Jews by birth and not Gentiles, we know a person's not justified by obeying all those rules. And again, the rules that they were primarily talking about were things like Sabbath. Jesus got in trouble all the time with guys about honoring the Sabbath. They were talking about circumcision, which was such a boundary marker in terms of their faith, and then the food rules, who you could eat with and what you could eat. And they weren't the deepest parts of the law. I mean, if you'd have asked a Jewish person if that was the most important parts of the law, they would have said no. Jesus has a conversation once with somebody, and he says the most important parts of love God and love your neighbor. And the teacher of the law says, well said. Yeah, that's the most important stuff. I mean, they agreed with Jesus on that. That wasn't a shock. But when they would fight with him, it was often about those boundary markers. John Ortberg, in one of his books, talks about how all churches, all religious people, all people really, have boundary markers. If you want to join a biker gang, then there's certain kinds of clothes you have to wear. You may have to let your facial hair grow a lot more than I've let mine grow. You're going to have to carry yourself a little. There are just certain boundary markers just by looking at a person that you can identify, oh, they're part of that group. You know, you can see it just by looking at them that they're part of that group. Boundary markers are highly visible, relatively superficial kind of practices that mark a person in a certain bunch. And Christians have those. You know, it's not just the Jews that had those way back with food rules or circumcision. Christians have those too. There's certain things that we elevate to fantastically important. That may not really be, in terms of the whole Bible, fantastically important, but we elevate it that way. Who you vote for, or how you dress. You know, even the Bible college I went to wouldn't allow you to wear certain kinds of clothes and in certain places. Really rigid dress code at that deal. Sometimes you could take a small, that we would agree it's maybe a sin, but it's a small sin, and we elevate it to something gigantic. Ortberg again says he could be the proudest preacher in the world, and for the most part, people will overlook that as long as the sermons are interesting every week. But if he were to smoke after the service, if I started to, after a really good sermon, I would light up a cigar out in the foyer. Well, they'd probably fire me for that. And there's not one elder, there's not one member of the congregation who would say cigar smoking is the worst sin, right? But it's one of those boundary markers that we do. Like, good Christians don't do this sort of thing, at least not in public. Well, that's kind of what all those rules were. And it offended Paul that Peter would let those kinds of things separate him from people who didn't know the Lord. And so he really challenges him on that. He says mainly those things lower our vision. There's a lot of people in our community, of course, who don't know God, and they don't act like they know God. I mean, they don't do all the different boundary markers that we do here at Mount Pleasant that allow us to separate people between good people and bad people. There's a lot of people who approach the world different than we do, but they all need Jesus. And we've got some sort of an obligation to keep reaching out to them, keep telling them about who he is and what he is. You know, today, for the most part, for most of you, at least if you live in Indiana here, you're going to have a lot of time on your hands. It's going to be hard to get out. I know there will be a handful of people who will have to test it, but it's going to be hard to get out. It's going to be hard to do things. It's a lazy day and an easy day just to watch sports, and I don't blame you if you do that, or if you want to watch an old movie or just kind of hang around and do puzzles. Nothing wrong with any of all that stuff, but today I want you to think about if there's any people who are outside of your normal circle of connections, who you know who need God. And I want you to think about pushing yourself to get out of your comfortable circle and reach over into them. I want you to think about today that we're just saved by grace. That none of us, if we're going to measure on our own goodness, have enough goodness to get to heaven. And that we need the Lord. It never goes away. And to take just a little bit of time, especially if you're there with some family or you've got some people there in the house, to at least just for a few minutes give God thanks for all his goodness. He's just been so good to us. And let's pray that God will use us to reach out to other people, to keep those doors wide open, and to remember that we can be tools in his hand to help bring the rest of this world in a closer relationship with him. God bless. I hope you have a great day today and a great week this week.